this clip. Let me run you this clip then of leaders of both Remain and Leave and what they said about the single market and about leaving the EU. Let's just listen to what they said.
The British public would be voting, if we leave, would be to leave the EU and leave the single market.
Should we come out the single market?
I think that is almost certainly would be the case, yes.
Do you want us to stay inside the single market, yes or no?
No, we should be outside the single market.
I had Michael Gove in that chair and I said, after Brexit, will we be in the European single market, yes or no? And he said no.
And he was right.
So we won't be in the European single market.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'd be out of the single market. That's the reality. Britain would be quitting the single market.
So there we have it. George Osborne, David Cameron, Andrea Leadsom, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove on both sides of the argument. If you vote to leave, you vote to leave the single market. What bit don't you understand?
Now, if you want to get out of the single market, which is what the Leave campaign want to do.
Sorry to stop you that, but again and again and again, in that chair, that very chair, there was Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, David Cameron, George Osborne, and I asked every single one of them, does coming out of the EU mean coming out of the single market? And every one of them said yes. So I take it that people understood that we were leaving the single market because it is so intertwined with the rest of the EU.
We're outside the single market, and we had a deal like, say, America does, which is what the head of the Leave campaign has recommended.
If the British people watch, and David Cameron says we'd have to leave the single market. George Osborne said we'd have to leave. Michael Gove said we'd have to leave. Andrea Leadsom said we'd have to leave. Boris Johnson said. Nick Clegg said it's clear we'd have to leave. What's your argument? The simple point on this is that even you were clear that if we voted to leave, we left membership of the single market.
What you saw me clipped, let's not mistranslate things, was I was saying that some Brexiteers had admitted that.
No, the Brexit campaign, you said, had come clean.
Just picture the scene. We're out of the single market, out of the European Union.
And I think both Leave and Remain were clear that if we vote to leave, we will leave the single market. And to me, that meant there's no automaticity between paying into a budget, supremacy of the law, control over your borders, your taxes and your trade policy.
So in your view, single market, yes or no?
No. Then if you remain a member of the single market, you have not left the European Union.
Imagine again if we left. So you've got the effect by leaving of losing access to the single market.
The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, we don't have a good deal with the European Union. For access to the single market, we pay a membership fee, we have the free movement of people, we have a massive regulatory burden, and we're prohibited and stopped from making our own trade friendships with the rest of the world. Do not believe them when they tell you tonight that the single market is good for Britain, that we need to be part of this club to access the single market. Every country in the world accesses the single market, and even in the worst case scenario, that Britain does not have a successful renegotiation and simply has to rely on WTO rules, even in that scenario, the cost of tariffs would be less than our net contribution.
It is worth stopping for a second to understand why coming out of the single market is so...
Well, the Brexiteers, like Gove and Johnson, say they want to leave the single market, and that means that we go on to WTO tariffs. And of course, as soon as we leave the European Union, the Prime Minister says that he will invoke Article 50, which means within 2 years we'll leave the European Union. And after that period, we will be out of the single market.
Leaving the single market would be an act of economic self-harm for...
We would be part of a free trade zone that extends from Iceland to the Russian border, that includes all the nations of the European landmass apart from Russia and Belarus. By being part of that free trade zone, we would have full access to the European market, but we would be freed from EU regulation that costs us billions of pounds every year. And free access to that market would also mean that we would not have to accept the European Court of Justice imposing unwanted rules on our manufacturers. We would also be free to take our own seat on the World Trade Organization, free, therefore, to press for more free trade deals across the world, including with countries like America and China and India, that the European Union, because of its bureaucratic clunkiness, has been unable to form a deal with.
The Leave campaign has admitted they would take us out of the single market.
You've said you'd come out of the single market.
Yeah. But if I can, I really am genuinely perplexed, because the single market, of course, created by your former boss, Margaret Thatcher, If you pull out of the single market, which you've just said you would.
If Heidi Alexander's view that we should stay in the single market continues and gains support from some in the Tory benches, we will effectively have ignored a referendum result. And if that happens, there will be a huge space in British politics for UKIP in a couple of years' time.
I put it to you that it is pretty clear what we were voting for at the time of the referendum. I was talking to Michael Gove, I can play the clip, but I said to him, does this mean coming out of the single market? And he said, yes, it absolutely does. It was absolutely clear that retaining or taking back control over immigration meant things that made our membership of the single market incompatible, and that therefore this sort of fantasy of a soft Brexit is simply a fantasy. No. I put it to you that you are actually trying to subvert the will of the British people in this referendum. They knew what they were voting for, and they were very clear.
I'm genuinely worried about Britain leaving the single market.